All right. Hello, welcome everybody. My name's Eden Kincaid and I'm a PhD student here at the University of Arizona in the Department of Geography. And I'm excited to welcome you all here to this event, which is part of the School of Geography, Development and Environment's Fall Colloquium Series. This event has been made possible through collaboration between SGDE, the Center for Regional Food Studies, the Dunbar Pavilion, the School of Anthropology, and also the Confluence Center at the U of A. So we're excited to have folks from various parts of the UA as well as the broader Tucson community and beyond joining us for today's talk with Dr. Ashanté Reese. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please shut off your mics if you're not speaking. And also if you could shut off your video, it would help with the Zoom functionality since this is a larger meeting. And Dr. Reese is going to start off with a talk, and then we're going to move into a roundtable with our panelists. And then after that, we'll open up to a Q&A from the audience. So I'll be moderating the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please either post them in the chat or send them, if you want to send them privately, you can send them to me. My name's Eden, once again, and I will receive your question. So we're very excited to have Dr. Ashanté Reese joining us today. And Dr. Ashanté Reese is currently a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She has a PhD in anthropology, as well as a master's in public anthropology and a BA in history and African American studies. And throughout her academic training and scholarship, Dr. Reese has focused on themes at the intersection of Black geographies and critical food studies, including issues of food access and food justice, as well as urban studies and the connections between carcerality and agriculture. And her work is shaped by Black epistemologies, as well as Black feminist thought and methods. If you could advance the slide, Lauren. And I just want to highlight some of Dr. Reese's work on these themes, including her book, Black Food Geographies, and a recently released volume called Black Food Matters, which she's co-edited. And Dr. Reese has also published her work in academic journals, including Antipode within the field of geography, as well as various public fora, including Civil Eats, Gravy, and Anthropology News. So Dr. Reese will be giving her talk, which will be followed by a roundtable with our panelists, Debbie Chess from the Dunbar Pavilion, Professor Jerome Dotson from Africana Studies here at the U of A, and Professor Megan Carney from Anthropology in the Center for Regional Food Studies. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Reese. So please join me in silently and awkwardly welcoming Dr. Reese to our colloquium.
Yay.
Thank you, Eden. If people will just give me a moment, I'm gonna set up to share my screen. And yes, all of these things are always super awkward, and we'll rock with it the best that we can. So first, a couple things. Just thank you to Professor Carney, to Laurel, Eden. Thank you all for inviting me, for all the centers and the schools that were mentioned. I was originally supposed to be there in the spring, and due to COVID, I wasn't able to come. So I'm happy that we at least get together in this way. And I hope we have a really great conversation. Just one note of correction. I know it was kind of a little stealthy, but I'm now at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, where I'm happy to be. It's a return home, so to speak. My family is nearby. I also just want to say, because I know it's something that's on everybody's mind, it is, I know our minds and our and maybe a lot of other things are being pulled in a lot of directions. So if any updates about the election come through, that is the moment when someone is free to interrupt me, okay? Otherwise, I just want to also give a shout of thanks to all the organizers that were working relentlessly during this election cycle and before, and in particular to organizers and my friends and people that I love and care about who've been organizing in Georgia for a very long time. And I'm always proud to be Southern, but so when I think about the work that they've been doing. So I will get started. Let me also apologize in advance that I'm sure we won't be able to get to all of the questions. My Twitter handle is there in the bottom of the screen. I'm happy to try to field questions and comments on Twitter after, but just bear with me if we can't get to everything. Lately, I've been reflecting on how my thinking has grown and changed over time. When I first started this work as a graduate student about 12 years ago, I was inspired to do it because of the seventh graders that I taught in Atlanta, Georgia. Their questions about differences in my neighborhood grocery stores and theirs became my questions. I love those students, I still do. Increasing access to healthy food was one way for me to demonstrate that love for them. And in some ways, it was enough. When I look back on my earliest thinking, access was a social justice imperative, but it wasn't one that I had connected to larger freedom dreams. Lately, I've been thinking about what it means to think and write beyond access. I have in the past shied away from questions that ask about solutions or answers to the food problem. It was an intentional and willful refusal. I didn't want to create or mimic prescriptive answers that were conjured in closed rooms and meetings, and that did not include the perspectives, experiences, or voices of people that I care about. In some ways, I never forgot the fact that no one had ever asked my students in Atlanta what they thought about food, what they thought about their own tastes, or really much of anything. My refusal was a reflection of a commitment to co-thinking, co-dreaming, and at some point, co-creating. What I've learned in my most recent years, though, is that even if that is true, and it is true, I needed to do some soul searching and unlearning to free my own limited imagination, or to at least bind my food futures that I wanted to see more firmly to Black freedom dreams. A couple of years ago, when my book was in press but had not been published, a mentor said to me, "Every book has its own failure, and that failure is an opportunity." I understood her words to be a critique of perfection, but also an invitation to be thoughtful about opening up to the idea that I might find within my own work a failure, read an opportunity that would open up further possibilities for theorizing and perhaps for being. Her words are with me daily now as I've had time to think about what I love about Black food geographies and what opportunities it affords me for further thinking, expansion, and freedom dreaming. What I now see as a failure, read opportunity, is the centrality of access in my own framing. So I want to offer a revision. So I'm amending the title of this presentation to what you see on the screen. I want to pause here to say I'm not suggesting that I'm against increasing food access. Obviously, I'm not. What I am suggesting is a pushback against access as the singular or even the primary framework through which we understand nourishment, which is one way of saying thinking about how we can more broadly nourish lives and not just bodies. If food justice is a movement, it has to be bigger than access. And if access is the center, if access is the dream, it just makes us better consumers and potentially healthier workers for a capitalist system. It aligns the things that make us human. I think that we can and we should dream bigger. I, like many other people who work in food justice, want basic life-sustaining things for all Black people. I want no one to go hungry in a world where we produce and waste enough food to efficiently feed the whole planet. I want no one to be deprived of choice. I want no single corporation to have the power to determine or influence taste, need, availability, or wages. I want our biological, social, and cultural food needs to be met with care. These are not only things that, these things are not only about need, but they're also what we deserve or what any human being deserves. When I think about food futures, I wander through and beyond these basics. The food system and the inequities it produces do more than maintain hierarchies of wealth and taste. They also attempt to steal our imaginations, and it forecloses possibilities for seeing and dreaming futures beyond restoring what should already be rightfully ours. The work of Black people the world over, in part, has been work of struggle, wrestling with the state and corporate, if not to protect us, to at least feed us. The work has also been to create and maintain lives through and beyond state and corporate neglect. That work of imagining is what I am turning to today. When people's basic needs are met, what then? I think about how I want us to feel, and I wonder, how do we take what already exists in fragments, bind them to the ancestral knowledges we carry and skills, stories, and our own bodies, and create Black food futures steeped not in struggle, but perhaps delight? What would it look like to feel and harness the power in Black kitchens and Black neighborhoods, at Black family reunions, and wherever Black people gather to create these conditions for nourishment? So today, I already mentioned, I'm presenting to you from Austin, Texas, and I'm thinking about 3 hours east of here, where I grew up, to where my grandmother's garden is, a small fenced-in plot of land behind her home in Porter Springs, Texas. I made a beeline for that garden many days, my feet carrying me through her front room, through her kitchen, and then out the back door when I didn't get an answer when I called her name. She'd be outside, bent over rows of tomatoes, collard greens, or whatever else she grew. Sometimes she sang. Most often, she was quiet as she cooked the vegetables from seed to table. My grandmother would probably be known as a recreational gardener these days. She didn't grow all of her own food, but what she did grow, she delighted in. She was of the generation that witnessed firsthand the ravages of tenant farming and sharecropping, her own kin fighting to keep control of their own land, part of which my family. She was under no illusions about what it meant to grow food, or how, in the gendered division of labor, the responsibility for feeding the family was primarily hers, the consequences of such also resting on her shoulders. And yet, she, like so many others, held on to a promise of growing and preparing food. So for a long time, I lamented not spending as much time with her as I could have in her garden. Had I done so, I thought maybe I would have more skill and I would have more passion to grow my own food. But as I've been thinking and reflecting on delight and thinking about Black experiences, I know, and I've always known, that elder and ancestral knowledges are not linear in that way. They are passed along through skill, but not unilaterally so, as they exceed skills transmission and elide one-dimensional time. So it wasn't the planting, it wasn't the harvesting, and it wasn't even all the meals that I had based on what she grew that has captured my attention lately. It's been delight. Black people have always found delight in spite of persecution and struggle, sometimes in the midst of it. There's a quote from Zora Neale Hurston's Moses, Man of the Mountain, which is her retelling of the biblical story of Moses through Black vernacular and folklore. Those words appear after the Egyptians drowned and the Israelites usher in their newfound liberation with song, dance, and glee. Moses, sitting on a boulder apart from the celebration, reflected on how they got there, how their previous crossings enabled this joyous one. One of the most cited quotes from Hurston's body of work comes at this particular moment. The present was an egg laid by the past that had the future inside its shell. I think of this text in relation to my grandmother, to the possibilities we now hold because of ancestors like her who forged space for delight. Food justice is nothing if it is not a future-making project. We take what we know, we collectively grapple with what we don't, and we try to create what does not yet exist in a sustainable way. So how do we get to a place and time where all people's food needs are met not with force, but with care? How do we get to where we anticipate and create the conditions for delight? I'm gonna pause my notes with 3 provocations. So if you'll just indulge me for a moment, these are a little bit of an interlude. The first one is that when we're thinking about policies aimed at addressing food access and food insecurity, we have to really grapple with the legacies of anti-Black racism and how that has shaped urban spaces. If we don't, it leads to unsustainable solutions. Here is a very crude way that I think about this. And food work, both academic work and I would say work on the ground or even activist work, there has been a lot of interest in dealing with race and racism. I'm not the first person who's brought this up in my own work. But I've seen the ways that thinking about race and racism is often treated as optional, right? As a part of a larger pie and a part of a larger segment of people who do work in critical food studies and food studies and critical food studies, right? And one of the framings that I've been working toward or thinking about for several years is what happens when we think about not race and racism as part of the food system, but anti-Blackness in particular as the conditions that produce and always surround our food system. And some very concrete ways that we might think about this, the enduring legacies of racial segregation, urban planning, suburban expansion and sprawl, and any of the ways that market logics are rendered colorblind or presumed to be colorblind. The second provocation is really one that is calling attention to the agency and the movement of Black folks who are in neighborhoods that we would label as low food access or impacted by food apartheid. They're navigating an unequal terrain in ways that may not be immediately visible, but they are valuable. And one way that I think about this in Black food geographies are these three very broad categories. One, the affective dimensions of accessing food. Really, how do people feel not only about their options, but what are their preferences? What are their joys, fears? What are these things that are part of their experience, their food experiences more broadly? The second is thinking about the ways people navigate the unequal urban landscape. And I love the word navigate, and I use it a lot because you think about someone navigating, they're steering a ship, or they are in control, or they're making decisions. And it's one of those things that feels really important as we're thinking about the built environment, to remember that people aren't simply pawns in a built environment, but people are navigating a terrain, even if it's unequal. And then the last piece is really thinking about the relationship to the built environment and how Black residents are either transgressing neighborhood boundaries, meaning shaping their food lives in a way that extend beyond the neighborhood, or also transforming it. And that in some ways looks like urban farming, urban gardening, and such. And then the third kind of provocation in this interlude is, if we're not careful, good intentions reify inequities, not alleviate them. And these are a set of questions that I think about when I am thinking about the work that organizations are doing in these. Who has decided the aims of that work? Who is in leadership? Who has power? What are the intended outcomes? I think these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask, especially since food justice has become this larger enterprise that very easily can be and has been usurped into a larger liberal project. And if you're interested in that, I definitely suggest picking up some of Alison Alcon's work and some of Julie Guthman's work, because I think they do a really great job of thinking about how neoliberalism shapes and sometimes thwarts the agenda of organizations, even if they were radical to begin with. So I want to come back to my notes and come back to delight. The conditions that produce Black suffering, dispossession, and death are important. It's the context in which we're all fighting. There are forces that we are fighting against. Anti-Blackness is, to quote Christina Sharp, the weather. And within that weather, there is both disaster and possibility. While we are, to quote Sharp again, constituted through and by continued vulnerability to these overwhelming forces, we're not only known to ourselves or to each other by that force. To put it another way, for our purposes, delight is and should be central to any notions of food justice. To neglect delight reduces Black people's needs to only being biological, stripping away the human emotions and feelings and experiences that exceed the biological. So here I am, once again, thinking about delight. Sorry, trying to click to the next slide. Come back. There you go. This photo is of my mother's hand. She is making tea cakes, a Southern delicacy that, for those of you who are in the room and don't know it, is kind of like a shortbread cookie, but definitely better than a shortbread cookie. Undoubtedly, their sweetness and Black Southerners' affection for them had to at least be a part of the reason why Zora Neale Hurston chose to name Janie's love interest after them in Their Eyes Were Watching God. My point here is that they're sweet, they're delicious, they're a must, and they're something that I have taken much more interest in lately. I'm Southern born, as you know, raised in what some would call a working class family, though that designation is complicated in the rural South for Black folks. When I went off to college and then off to teach and then again to a PhD, I traversed many different environments, collecting social and cultural capital along the way. These tea cakes, or rather my mother's preparation of them, kept us tethered through every move I made, through my stints with veganism, and through the class straddling that my work and life requires. When I was away, my mother would mail them to me and to friends, a form of labor that I associate with love. On the day that I took this photo, I was home for the holidays and I was watching her make these cookies for me. And again, I was not just watching her do labor, I was watching her delight in making these cookies. I didn't need them, not in terms of biology anyway. And in fact, depending on who you ask, they might be considered antithetical to food justice completely, because can I really call this so-called healthy food? But I needed them otherwise, for what they expressed in terms of care and affection, and for what they offered my mother and me in a way that I think only food can: connection. In Freedom Dreams, Robin Kelly writes, "Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down." And he continues on to say that a map to the new world is in the imagination. In his work on the Black radical tradition more broadly, Kelly points to Black social movements as case studies in the development of freedom dreams over time, pushing back against the binary framing of success and failure as the only measures of those dreams and the movements that birthed them. Through organizing, art, poetry, music, and deep study, Black communities have dreamt of new lands, new ways of relating socially and economically, and new forms of freedom. Lately, I'm thinking about what creativity means for altering conditions or for navigating the weather. Specifically, I'm thinking about cooking and recipes. What happens when we put recipes, improvisation, and traditional research methods investigating forms of anti-Blackness in conversation with each other? My current project, The Carceral Life of Sugar, enters debates about racism and carcerality in the food system through exploring the ongoing significance of plantation structures. Through socio-historical analysis of sugarcane cultivation by Texas state prisoners, and then later contemporary explorations of sugar consumption in the US, I ask, what is the relevance of the plantation structure in developing Texas state prisons in US cities and in our contemporary sugar consumption? How does sugar function as a carceral technology within and beyond prisons? And how does the history of prisons used in sugar production inform an abolitionist food justice theory and practice? My focus on sugar was prompted by the 2018 unearthing of 95 graves at a construction site in Sugar Land, Texas, the city itself named for being the center of sugar production in the state. The remains, publicly referred to as the Sugar Land 95, are the remains of former convict laborers presumably leased to work for Imperial Sugar Company, the largest, most successful sugar company in Texas that in part grew in size and value as a result of the prison labor used to build it. The Sugar Land 95 are a link along the continuum of unfreedom and Texas vis-a-vis Imperial Sugar and the prison system within a larger context of colonialism, plantations, and sugar production and consumption. Their labor in the past tethers us who consume outside prisons to carceral structures that continue to inform the contemporary food system and the development of cities themselves, like Sugarland. The project is arguing that our contemporary need for sugar in particular is materially connected to these plantation pasts, that these pasts have mapped a way toward plantation futures and which carceral structures are part of our everyday lives we consume. In Plantation Futures, Catherine McKittrick argues that the development of the Americas is linked to the plantation as a site of violence and resistance. To think through these relations, she offers Plantation Futures as a theoretical and temporal framework that is a conceptualization of time and space that tracks the plantation, prison, and the impoverished and destroyed city sectors, and consequently brings into sharp focus the ways the plantation is an ongoing locus of anti-Black violence and death that can no longer analytically sustain that violence. For those of us who are interested in addressing race, space, and premature and preventable death, Plantation Futures demand decolonial thinking that is predicated on human life. Working within a similar frame, Deborah Thomas asked the question, what does it mean to be human politically in the wake of the plantation? Thomas then proceeds to consider the ways the plantation undergirds sovereignty and how internal resistance threatens them. Though food production can materially be traced back to plantations across the US South, little work draws links between the contemporary food system and these plantation pasts or their traces in the present. So one goal of my project is to map sugar's carceral function in Black lives across space, time, and locations. Using a methodological approach that fuses archival research, participant observation, and a bit of autoethnography, this project takes up McKittrick's claim by tracking sugar through various spatial configurations, the plantation, the prison, the city, and then to my own kitchen. In doing so, I also take up a challenge from Sydney Mintz, who articulated in Sweetness and Power, that we should always think to put consumption together with production. So this project is invested in exploring resistance, as I said, or as Catherine McKittrick argues, to think about how locations of anti-Black violence are spaces of encounter that might hold in them useful anti-colonial practices and narratives. In addition to archival work and participate in this participant observation, I'm exploring recipes as a potential decolonial praxis and possibilities. Part of my methodology includes cooking, guided by the question, what can recipes teach us about embodying an abolitionist praxis? What teach us about, as Christina Sharp urges us, how to live in the wake of slavery and slavery's afterlives, the afterlife of property, and how, in short, to inhabit and rupture this episteme with their and with our knowable lives. In doing these cooking experiments, I'm also employing what Anand Pandian articulated as the aspirational work of an anthropology that is both empirical and highly speculative, attacking between close attention to what is and sweeping imagination of what else will be. And perhaps also in the process, I'm creating some space for working with and thinking about Verda Mae Grosvenor's vibration cooking as not just a method for preparing food, but also a lesson, perhaps an epistemology of Black improvisation and world making. Well, let me see if I can play this short video for you. This short video is of me playing with dough. I am making tea cakes like my mother. And like my mother, I am making them as an offering. But the offering isn't for the living, it's for the dead. Using a recipe from Imperial Sugar Company's 1920s cookbook, one that I altered a bit to make it my own, and sugar made by the same company, I made these tea cakes for an altar that I constructed for the Sugarland 95. It is the first of what may be many embodied experiences in exploring sweetness in an anti-Black world. I set out what I needed: flour, buttermilk, imperial sugar, vanilla extract, an egg, measuring cups, a mixing bowl, a mixer. I had thought about the ingredients, but very little about method. It wasn't until I was pulling out the ingredients that I realized I hadn't decided where I was going to roll out this dough. And that realization begat another. I also hadn't thought about how I was going to roll out this dough. Both thoughts, the where and the how, triggered memories in my body. Memories of both my grandmother and my mother using their countertops as workspace for rolling out dough. I chuckled to myself as I thought, I hope these bougie ass granite countertops work as well as theirs did. Memories of my grandmother rolling dough with a mason jar or glass instead of a rolling pin. When I shared that memory with a friend, she remarked, yeah, my mother did that too. She said it rolls better that way. These Black mothers across space and time making use of everyday materials to bring forth sweetness. I decided I would do the same. Without another surface or a rolling pin, I really didn't have a choice. Improvisation at its best. I sprinkled flour on the clean granite surface and plopped the dough down. Is it too gooey? Should I add anything? I thought as I rolled the dough on the surface, kneaded it into balls before smashing it again. As the dough rolled, so did my emotions, taking on shapes that surprised me. More memories, fragmented thoughts of making a way out of no way, appreciation for ingenuity and care, and then questions. If food justice is reframed through a lens of Black improvisation and experimentation, what might we learn about freedom and abolition? I believe that one day all Black people will have those necessities that I talked about in the beginning. And when we do, I'm always wondering if we're ready to create and hold down food that build on the best of our lineages and practices rather than the worst that reproduce inequities. What futures do the eggs produced by our ancestors hold? What past lessons and experiences have prepared us for food futures defined not by struggle, but by delight? And the food futures that I see, we're drawing on creativity and ingenuity that have sustained Black lives through colonialism, enslavement, theft of land and body, and over policing. In the food futures I look forward to, our food lives are not measured by prescriptive outputs. They're not constrained by through policy, but instead we build on pasts and the present to give our food and our communities a future in which we have space and time for delight in feeding ourselves and each other, a future in which holistic nourishment is the goal, to which we hold ourselves accountable. We are creating this already, I think, in gardens and farms, in meals, perhaps in some of these experiments in our kitchens. My invitation to you for today is perhaps let's tarry there for a minute and give our food lives a different future. Thank you.
I guess I can cut that up. Thank you so much, Dr. Reese, for your talk. You gave us a lot to think about and work with. So now for the next half hour or so, we're going to transition into a roundtable with our panelists. And I'll just start by introducing those panelists, and then they'll take it from there. So first we have Debbie Chess, who is the executive director of the Dunbar Pavilion and a resident of Tucson's historic Dunbar Springs neighborhood. And for those of you who don't know about the Dunbar Pavilion, it describes itself as a beacon for social and cultural enlightenment, educating, preserving, and celebrating the rich history and culture of people of African descent, while stimulating community collaboration that captures and continues our legacy. Debbie's professional work sits at the intersection of urban planning practices, cultural preservation and futurism, and the cultivation of just environments. And she is the mother of 3 and grandmother to 1 grandson. Next, we have Dr. Jerome Dodson. And Dr. Dodson is an assistant professor in Africana Studies here at the U of A. He holds a PhD in US history and an MA in African American Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research and teaching interests focus on African American history, Southern foodways, hip hop, folklore, and body politics. And he's currently working on various publications in this realm, including a book-length manuscript, which is tentatively titled No Pork on My Fork, Race, Diet, and the Making of Black Consumptive Politics, 1830 to 1990. Looking at Black embodiment through the lens of food discourse, this book explores how Black abolitionists, religious leaders, musicians, television writers, Black physicians, nurses, and hip hop artists employed dietary reform and food discourse to construct consumptive ideologies that work to promote notions of Black autonomy and to make Black health concerns more visible. And third, we have Dr. Megan Carney. Megan Carney is a sociocultural and critical medical anthropologist here at the University of Arizona. She's also the director of the Center for Regional Food Studies. And her research and teaching engages topics of transnational migration, food systems, migrant health, and immigration policy, both in the US and in the Mediterranean. And you can learn more about Dr. Carney's work through her first book entitled The Unending Hunger, Tracing Women and Food Security Across Borders, and her forthcoming book, Island of Hope, Migration and Solidarity in the Mediterranean. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to Debbie Chess.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Reese, for that presentation. There's so much there. I want to give everybody on the webinar a little bit of context about how we've come together. About 2 years ago, myself, Dr. Carney, we're looking at ways in which we can reclaim ways of healing and ways that the African-American community has sustained itself over centuries, especially under the conditions of slavery and oppression, and those things being rooted in health and wellness and food and well-being. So we collaborated on a grant with the Agnes Howry Foundation out of the University of Arizona, and came and developed a Dunbar Health and Wellness program. And part of that is the fact that the Dunbar, in addition to being what Eden described as a beacon for the African-American community, it's important to know that the Dunbar was the formerly segregated school in Tucson, and that every African-American child from the 1st to 6th grade went to school in this space. And so it is a space of trauma. So we looked at how do we take this space, this Black space, and reverse the trajectory of epigenetic illnesses, use this space as a space of healing. So we've come together here. So it's really exciting that here in year 2, we've had the opportunity to work with Dr. Reese in this presentation about Black food geographies, because a big piece of that is the garden, the Dunbar Garden that exists at the space, and it is also part of the health and wellness program at the University of Arizona. I mean, at the Dunbar Pavilion. So those of you in Tucson, I encourage you to engage with the work and come by and look at the garden. Part of the outputs of the work will be a recipe book, a cookbook that you spoke of. I love the way you talked about improvising, Dr. Reese, and recipes and delights, because that is part of the work of the wellness program, the output of a cookbook, a wellness guide, and a plant catalog, because our space sits on indigenous land, or our garden is on indigenous land that also has quite a few healing plants. And so working with Dr. Patricia Gonzalez out of Mexican American Studies to identify those plants and really talk about their medicinal purposes. And so I would like to hear from Dr. Carney about anything that I may have missed around our engagement and our work together over the past 2 years, and how that's fed Dr. Reese's coming here today, or being present online today.
First of all, I apologize if my connection is not super solid. I think we're having some connectivity issues here today, so I will speak slowly and as clearly as possible. No, Debbie, I think you summarized our collaboration beautifully. And for folks who are interested, I provided a link to a short blog that Debbie and I recently co-wrote with a student who has also been involved in the collaboration, and it gives more detail and history to the project. Dr. Reese, thank you so much for preparing this presentation today. And at the risk of sounding cliche, it gives us much food for thought, especially in what feels like very desperate times, but also very fruitful times. And I have prepared a number of questions, topics that I would love to explore with you and our other panelists, but I do want to give Dr. Dotson, excuse me, an opportunity first to bring up any questions or comments at this time.
Sorry about that. I think that I will go ahead. Dr. Reese, thank you so much again for this talk. I mean, I literally enjoyed every aspect. But as I was listening, I guess I'm really taken by your discussion of delight in food, especially as a kind of chubby and heavy-set Southern kid. Like, I get food and delight, but I can also remember, right, growing up, how that could get a lot of side eye and consternation. And I guess even thinking a little further with this, when my partner and I were working in Seattle at the University of Washington, she had a job there, and I was working with African-American graduate students with African-American students, and they talked about how they were really excited, or in some were actually embarrassed, however, about the serving of soul food in the cafeteria. And so when you started talking about food and delight, I guess one of the things I wondered about are there ways in which, when we're working potentially with younger folk, that we can maybe work through some of the longer history of these kind of food stereotypes that I think can get in the way, right, of really appreciating and delighting in consumption? I don't know if that makes sense, but that was immediately what I thought about hearing this.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Dotson, for that comment and for the question. As you were talking, I was thinking about a couple of things. One, I thought about Julie Guthman's kind of framing of and critique of health and healthiness, and its connection to capitalism and healthy workers and healthy bodies, and how that creates the conditions, and I think an aesthetic around what it looks like, right? And so your first mention kind of referred to your own self and own body. It made me think of that really some of the conversations that we're having about health, I find to be completely disingenuous, right? They're not about health. Really, they're about discipline and an aesthetic. And so I also want to point out too that I recognize me talking about delighting in food and eating as a relatively small framed woman it takes a different tone than if someone in a different body had given this same talk, right? So I want to name that. The second thing that I thought about when you were talking, and I know you're familiar with Dr. Williams Forson's work, but it made me think about that sometimes our thinking about stereotypes becomes so all-consuming, we forget that there's some actually really beautiful history and legacies around not just soul food, but the preparation of food itself, right? And I love the way she takes that up in her work. So I guess some of what I've been thinking about lately in terms of the kind of subtext of this question is, how do we kind of correct a course? In some ways, I've been thinking about maybe we can reframe the questions a bit, and how do we center the things want to see and decenter the things that we don't want. And so that in part is partly what I was thinking about in terms of delight. And also exactly what you were just saying, so much of Black people's food, if we Googled right now, would come up with so much negative stuff, right? Not a lot of positive. So I think that there's a reframing there. The last thing I'm going to say is I thought about one time during my field work, and I was working with younger kids. They were all probably 10 and younger. And the recreation center where I worked always wanted me to do healthy eating demonstrations with the kids. And I was like, oh yeah, I don't do that. But they kept, asking. And so I finally did something with them and was doing the smoothie making project. And I just remember how excited the kids were. It wasn't even about the smoothie. It really was that someone took any interest in their own taste. I will not forget that. And I think that that's really important of what my friend and collaborator and the person who wrote the foreword to my book, Dara Cooper, talks about a lot with her work in Chicago, that she developed a program to where kids could trade in chips for like fruits and vegetables. And they would do it. They would come with their hot Cheetos and like, I'll take these carrots instead. So I think I wonder if sometimes our imaginations are limited, not just in what we think is possible, but in what is already happening. Like maybe kids already have some thoughts about what they, think and feel around food. So I know that's kind of a roundabout answer, but.
You bring up a really interesting point to me around nostalgia and memory around food, Dr. Reese. And I know in chapter 3, you really in Black food geographies, you go into depth around looking at our memories around food and how we might almost romanticize food and our connection to gardening and all of that. And I'm finding that in the work that we're doing here in Tucson, is that there is this idea, right, of what it is to be a gardener and what it is to grow your own food, and it's really romanticized. But when it comes to getting, the work and what it yields, what a backyard garden can really yield, can it really sustain you? And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about the nostalgia of Black food production and the memories that we have. And as our culture tends to be co-opted, and we're looking at the ways in which Black culture is shifting. What is Black culture is one of the things that you ask or what is culture is one of the things that you ask in chapter 3 of the book. I wonder if you have any further comments about that.
Yeah, for those who haven't read Black food geographies yet, in the middle, there's this chapter where I'm thinking about memory and nostalgia. And it's also a chapter that I feel like, going back, I wish I maybe had spent some more time thinking about, because on the one hand, well, not on the one hand, memory is powerful. And I think there's also this way that memory gets reconstituted, or sometimes it fails us. And that in the work that we're doing, there's this trying to create a present and a future by what we remember or something remember. And I think the thing about nostalgia is that we're nostalgic for things, but not in their whole selves, right? Like we're nostalgic. We're nostalgic for the best of a thing, not necessarily the worst of the thing. So when I say that because growing food is cute, unless you're a full-time farmer who doesn't make enough money to even feed yourself, even though you're doing all this growing, right? Or you have ailments because you're bent over or doing this work. Like it's hard work. And I think sometimes that gets lost. But what I will say about nostalgia, at least my research experience and my personal experience, is that there is something deeply moving about trying to reconnect with paths and histories that you maybe never thought that you would be able to, right? And I think that like that little video that I shared with the cooking, it really, maybe it shouldn't have, but it really surprised me how emotional I got when I realized that like I was doing the same thing that my mother and my grandmother had done. And that meant something to me. Maybe that didn't shift an actual material condition, but it meant something to me. And I think this is what I'm trying to through with my current project, is what happens when we marry the kind of work that we're doing out there to like shift policy, like burn all this shit down, with an actual embodied practice. And I think some of that is influenced by my experience as a yogi. I think being in our own bodies is important. And I think being in my own body as a Black woman is particularly important when and we have not always had the rights to our own bodies. And there are still people who do not have the rights to their own bodies. So what does that help us do? And I think nostalgia also allows us to pay respect, for lack of a better term, to people and to histories and to ancestors who didn't get to do what we do.
Actually, if I could jump on that theme, Dr. Reese, I have long admired your embodied praxis, the way that you have a very seamless connection between your research and your teaching and advocacy and your yoga and mindfulness. And I just really appreciate how you're modeling that to those who are aspiring anthropologists, but also to geographers and other related disciplines. I actually wanted to steer us back to talking more about, I really appreciate that you're pushing back on access in your talk today as this overarching framework, that it's limiting, and we have to perhaps embrace other analytics. You talk about not forcing, right, the need to meet people's needs, but rather enacting forms of care to meet those needs. So looking at the state of our society right now during pandemic, and it's difficult to overstate the levels of food insecurity, especially affecting people of color in this particular moment. But we also shouldn't exceptionalize that either. This is not just a momentary crisis. This is building on decades and really centuries of systematic marginalization and anti-Blackness. I know in your own work, you emphasize, you highlight those strategies of self-reliance. And I'm just wondering, in what you elaborated on today, where are the possibilities for self-reliance in this kind of, how did you frame it? Black improvisation? Yeah, if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a question. I think self-reliance, I think about a lot. And I think in the last, I know, Dr. Carney, when you're writing a book and by the time you're at the end, you're like, yo, where I was thinking at the beginning of this book feels very different at the end of the book. And so toward the end, there's this kind of way that I'm reflecting on both the possibilities and the limits of self-reliance. And where I've landed more recently is really thinking about self-reliance in relation to food sovereignty and the word sovereignty itself, and to framings of self-determination. And I think self-reliance is a strategy in route to something bigger like sovereignty, is where I've landed. And so I think things like there's the gardening examples that I've used, but lately I've been also thinking about things like just who controls different food infrastructures more broadly, and what's possible when people are doing things more like organizing around food co-ops or land co-ops. What does that organizing, what possibilities does that organizing open up? And lately I've been thinking a lot about Renaissance co-op in North Carolina, because it closed a year or so ago. Maybe it's been 2 years ago. And I know people were really sad about it. And I was really sad about it. And now I'm thinking about it today. I'm like, wow, what a rehearsal in freedom to like get together these mostly Black neighbors who had not had a supermarket in their neighborhood for 20 years and open this food co-op, right? Like that is the embodiment of a self-reliance praxis on the way to something else, right? On that something else, I think is something that we're all still figuring out. And if you ask me, because you did, I think that something else partially relies on the abolition of private property and capitalism, right? But in the meantime, I want people's needs to be met. We're hopefully not that far off from abolishing such things, but maybe we won't see them in our lifetimes. And so what kinds of improvisation happen? Things like Renaissance Co-op, which takes a lot of, there's this thing I think I'm also working out, which is there's the kind of unscripted improvising that pairs and marries with work, right? Like people had to fundraise to start a co-op, right? So like, where does the improvisation come in? And I think part of it is thinking about like faith, whatever that means to people, and the kind of ingenuity and intuition that people have to enact to make things happen. Last thing I would say is I've seen this, maybe you've seen this too, but during the pandemic, I feel like more people have gotten interested in food and where food comes from and how it's grown than I have ever seen. I think partially in part because of panics about grocery stores being bare at the early parts of the pandemic. And so I've been really inspired by things like the different forms of mutual aid, like community fridges, or the National Black Food and Justice Alliance had a mutual aid fund and redistributed funds to organizations. And SAFON, the Southeast African American Farmers Organic Network, was redistributing funds to farmers who were struggling. And I think that is the praxis of care. And I think at the heart of self-reliance, as I talk about in the book, is really not about the individual self, but like this kind of collective enmeshment in the self. At the heart of that is like, I'm gonna take care of you, and I'm gonna make sure you have what you need. And I think those examples that I point out were, in different ways operating from a sense of, it is my responsibility to also take care of you.
Thank you.
Can I ask Dr. Dotson a question? I don't know if I'm supposed to ask the other panelists a question.
This is should be more of a roundtable. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was reading a little bit about your book project, and I got really excited, and I wanted to hear more, if at all, like how understandings of Black radical tradition or kind of factor into your work. And then the second thing I was thinking about is, as you've been writing your book, where does purity come in? Because I think a lot about this too, this kind of purity politics that infiltrates some movements around food. So I'm curious.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'll start with the purity one first, because one of the people that I'm reading or thinking about purity through is she's a Pentecostal preacher in the 1890s and 1900s. And one of the things she does is talk about the need for cleanliness in diet. And cleanliness in diet becomes a kind of metaphor for her to talk about, I think, more broadly concerns about purification in large measure because of urbanization, right? So it's a kind of, that became for me a kind of lens into thinking about bodily cleanliness. In some ways, I think you even see folks like Du Bois wrestling with this through his discussions of things like tuberculosis. So one of the things I try and think through then are the ways that purity can kind of operate, or cleanliness, right? When thinking about diet and nutrition, and particularly cleanliness being then abstaining from, for her, pork, booze, all those kinds of things. Ironically, I'd say in many respects, right, things that bring delight are then in part what's policed. Part of the reason, right, I'm especially interested in this Pentecostal lady is because she presages folks like Elijah Muhammad, right, who's going to come along and say the same thing. And in many respects, then you see the Adventists in the 1890s, 19 teens doing the same kind of thing, wrestling with and trying to make sense of purity in their bodies via diet. And I think in many respects, it's the Nation of Islam who by the 50s is going to take that and run. I mean, take it to a much more Black radical sort of position. And that's in part where in my book, I bring in Black radicalism, thinking about then folks like Elijah Muhammad and his concerns around particularly pork as a kind of immoral stain, but also the ways that pork can frankly be used by Muhammad to even assert ideas about patriarchy, right? So in many respects, part of his policing diet is also about policing women's labor and bodies. And you see this, especially even, one of the ways I get at this is through cartoons. And so the Nation of Islam has cartoonists, in particular, Gerald 2X, and why am I blanking on this guy? Oh, Majid is his name, who really worked to kind of embody the rhetoric of Elijah Muhammad. And to do that, then they especially focus on projecting these images of soul food and frankly, obesity, right? So anytime you see someone who has a piece of pork in their mouth, they are heavy set. When you see someone who's abiding by the Nation of Islam strictures, right, the women are svelte, the men are clean. And so in that way, right, you can kind of code these understandings about health by the body. That's part of the reason I even ask my question, is because I'm still trying to wrestle through what this means even, right, in the book. But so anyway, I also then look at the ways that the Nation of Islam then marshals the image of Muhammad Ali, because Ali also talks a lot about diet and the way it transforms him, makes him more fit to fight, gives him this clarity of purpose and vision. And so I use then both Muhammad and Lee to think through some of the ways that like Black radicals are trying to reshape the body. In many respects, I think in response to things even like integration, right? So in order to create a fully separate, autonomous, independent Black body, then right, we have to liberate the stomach. And so part of my work looks at then trying to understand the ramifications of that discourse, say through imagery, but then also literal people like Ali, because I think Ali becomes this kind of visual icon in some ways that Muhammad can marshal to say, hey, don't eat pork, look like this guy. I'm being facetious, but in part, I think that you can kind of work hand in hand like that. I'm also, though, I'll admit, drawing on other folks who've written about Black radicalism and diet, like the Panthers, et cetera, and then I'll just shut up. But I'm also really drawing on them as well, because I think they further help us understand how, right, then food policy wasn't just a concern per se of necessarily SEL folk integrationists, but it was always central for, again, those Black radicals. Yeah.
I have a little comment or a question for both of you. So then, that idea of purity also kind of on the flip side of that comes food shame, right? Food shaming of the Black diet and food shaming. You had mentioned earlier, Dr. Dotson, that serving soul food in the cafeteria and how that looking down upon. And so I'm wondering where that food shaming and this idea of purity intersects with how Black folks live and their everyday lives and are making food choices of both production and consumption that Dr. Reese had talked about earlier in this. So I'm wondering where your thoughts are about that, about food shame.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot of thoughts about food shaming. First of all, I also want to shout out Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson again, because she is writing a book about food shaming in Black communities right now. And I think, and has given some talks about it, and it's exciting to think about. So be on the lookout for Psyche's new book. I think food shaming shows up in a lot of ways. Thank you, Dr. Dotson, for mentioning the ones that you mentioned in the video. And I'm also still thinking about what is the context that produces the shame itself, right? Like, what are the conditions that produce food being policed? I'm going back to the cafeteria example that you gave, and I'm thinking, wow, like the focus is so much on the food. It isn't on like who's doing the shame. Like what makes someone feels uncomfortable? Is it the setup of the space? Is it the fact that for whatever reason, fried chicken is only on Friday? Why can't it be on other days? Like there are these conditions that are producing the possibility and the potential of shame. And I think in my work and thinking, I'm often thinking about that. Like what is it that induces the possibility of shame? And I think a lot of it has to do with like social arrangements and spatial arrangements, in addition to all the things that we know about kind of ideal body aesthetics and all that kind of stuff. The other thing, there's a book, and I know I'm gonna type these suggestions into the chat when I can, that came out, I guess, 2016. I'm looking at my bookshelf to see if I can find it. Dethroning Deceitful Pork Chop. I think is really important for thinking about how do we restore diverse, nuanced, complex histories of Black food. And I think in part of the food shaming that happens around soul food is A, people have misunderstandings, but also B, there's this struggle that happens when like Black culinary history and expertise has been diluted or completely erased, right? And that's not to say soul food isn't great. Soul food is great, right? But I'm saying that like there are so many culinary histories that got filtered out on this one narrative, and I don't know that always has worked in our favor. And I think that creates a condition for shame.
Or as you outline so well in Black Food Matters, appropriated and or stolen.
That part too, yeah.
I know Debbie is also reading Black Food Matters, and my students right now in the anthropology of food are reading Black Food Matters. And that text you and Dr. Hannah Garth outline so articulately and eloquently the stakes, and not just for Black Food Matters, but for Black Lives Matter. And I strongly feel that that book should be required reading. We need to center this kind of Black food literacy and history in K through 12 education in this country. But I'll get off of my soapbox and just ask you that there's clearly, you know, so many of us are gathered here right now because we we are drawn to food as a lens for examining broader inequalities and injustices in our society. And I just would love to hear you, and also others on this panel right now, elaborate on the possibilities and potentials for using the framework of Black Food Matters for advancing the movement for Black lives.
Yeah, so when the Movement for Black Lives published their platform in 2016, their policy platform in 2016, which was expansive and people took it up in all directions, I was both curious about and a little disheartened by how few people paid attention to the part of their platform that attended to food and land. I was actually like, wow, this is really interesting to me. Like there's beautiful stuff here. And they have taken some time to really think through pieces related to food and land that were exciting to me. So I think Black Food Matters, first of all, as I was thinking about Black food geographies, and I know I talk about this in the conclusion, is that most people that I was talking to, they weren't just thinking about food. They were also thinking about not getting paid enough, or not, you know, not having enough money in some cases, or having to drive really far. Like there are these compounding things that were happening in their lives. And I think what's interesting to me about food is how I can draw people in to think I'm talking about food, and I'm like, gotcha, I'm not really talking about food. I'm talking about all these other things too. And I think that works in a way. The other thing that I think about is food inequities make me think about this relationship between these kind of, for lack of a better term, quick and slow violence. And I think food gives us a lens to think about what are people navigating on a daily basis that has an impact on their bodies. I'm thinking about Na Oyo Kwate has an article called Race Against Time that is one of my favorite theorizations of time, because she talks about time as a social determinant of health. And I had never read any, it was super creative, but it made me think about the cumulative effects of having to drive so far to get food, or feeling unsafe in your neighborhood. What happens when you're having those things coming at you from multiple angles, right? And I think food gives a way, quite frankly, because people seem to not think food is political, it also gives a way of sneaking up on people and being like, you thought you were going to read this book about some poor Black people who don't know how to eat well, and now you're also reading this other thing, right? And I think that for me, it's really cool to think about how to hook people, how to get people on the hook. And I think we do that in this book. Hannah and I do this in this book. And I think we both do it in individual work. I also wanted to say that Hannah does work internationally. So if you're interested in work, she has a book on food in Cuba that's really beautifully written. Yes, hi, Allison Alcon in the chat. Food studies as a bait and switch. I'm here for the bait and switch. Helps me get in rooms to talk about things that I care about with people who might not have otherwise invited me, right? Like people hear food, and you know, dietitians might invite me to speak to them, and then I'm like, surprise, let me tell you what I think about the context in which the work that you're doing, and maybe like we can have a dialogue, right? And I think that is that can be meaningful and valuable.
So we have a handful of questions. Oh, sorry, Debbie. Did you want to remark on something?
Debbie, you're muted.
I just appreciate so deeply this intersection between urban planning, space, and Black agency in food. And I just really quickly want to comment, Dr. Reese, on there was a piece in your introduction where you're referring to Dr. Johnson's or Mr. Johnson's garden, and how it was just this very subtle affirmation of reclaiming of space, reclaiming of agency, and reclaiming of his own health practice and his own practice of production and consumption. So I just wanted to point to that as you talk about, the bait and switch, where you bring folks in and in this idea of food, and we all have a preconceived notion of this. But as an urban planner myself, I absolutely appreciate how you've made those links between ownership of space, agency of space, and agency of the body, and agency of consumption. That's all I wanted to comment.
Thank you for that. I feel like what you also just said reminded me that the work of liberation is always multiscalar. So I think as a researcher, I'm thinking, I'm doing work, I hope I'm doing work that is in pursuit of something, ultimately like a world where we all feel free. And how can I do that effectively? So I'm always thinking about that. And like, my current book project is interesting, and I think a lot of people will be interested in it, and I'm all for, like the shock value and then pulling people in. But really, I'm just trying to write toward abolition. So like, I might not use that immediately in the frame, depending on who, sometimes I do, depending on who I'm talking to, but I'm trying to think through like, what is a world, not just what does a world without prisons look like, but like, what is a world without the social structures that are continuously requiring death and hierarchy to survive? What does our world look like without it? That's what I'm writing toward always, right? And so to me, the puzzle is trying to figure out how to write that in a way where people will read it, and how to write it in a way where people will not only read it, but like really stop and attend to it and think about their own self in this relations. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been really stimulating to hear you all talking. I guess now we can open it up to some questions from the audience. I've collected a handful from the chat. So this is addressed to all of the panelists or whoever feels compelled to respond. So one of our participants said that they watch Vivian Howard's on PBS and can't understand why someone like Michael Twitty, who wrote The Cooking Gene, can't get a show where she can. She's allowed to showcase Southern food through her lens, and Black culture and tradition seems to only be elevated by someone who's not of color. So this kind of gets back at the questions of appropriation and representation. So any thoughts about this kind of dynamic?
Somebody was going to unmute themselves. Who was it? Okay, I'll just say the one thing that I want to say quickly is that kind of dynamic is reflective of a larger dynamic, which is that Black people, we get to be experts of our own experiences, and often we're not thought to have anything to contribute to like a larger theorization of like humanity, right? So it's like this debate and research around like, are you writing about a particular experience, or are you writing about like something that is universal? And it's always interesting to me to think about how that gets taken up out in public space. And I think that is one thing, right? That like, if Michael Twitty have a show, how would that be read? Would that be read as a show that only would be interesting to Black people and thinking about Black food, versus someone else who has a show who might still be cooking the same foods, and it's like, oh, this person is thinking about connection and meaning and history, like all these things that are universal, near universal kinds of concepts. And so I think that is a part of how anti-Blackness works also.
Yeah, and that question kind of reminds me, I've recently heard an interview on NPR, and I can't think of the Ethiopian chef who has the Red Rooster restaurant in Harlem, I believe. And he made the comment that, when you talk about chocolate, You talk about Belgian chocolate. You talk about French roast coffee, when in fact, chocolate is coming out of Afro-Caribbean countries, you know, and the coffee is Kenyan coffee. And until it's put into a European context, it has of little value, right? Or of no value. And so that narrative of how we take the production of food on the African continent and these Afro-Caribbean countries, how their value isn't seen until it has to be put into a European context in order for it to have value is really interesting to me.
And I'll just add in there too that when we look at, say, the origins of, say, Southern food, and particularly related to plantation cooking, much of that whole style of cuisine is developing at the same time that, right, they're developing racial policies which promote Black subservience and denigration. So I think when we remember the origins of these foods, I think it's not as surprising to still see a kind of need to have, for lack of a better way of putting it, perhaps, right, non-of color faces making this food because of, again, that history in plantation cuisine that I think also, right, normalized the practice.
Wait, has anybody seen that barbecue show on Netflix? I don't know, like Great American Barbecue Showdown. I don't know what it's called, but they have one challenge where they have to use like old school like cooking implements, and one of them was from like the 1830s or something like that. And I was like, are we clearly not gonna reference slavery? It was something like this would have been used in the US South and I was like, oh, this is a whole ass thing. I'm really not sure what to do with this. And there was also some really poor referencing and context around indigenous cooking too. But that was to your point around kind of like stripping the cooking from these contexts and histories, I think is interesting.
And that's also a danger of food studies, is just this like romanticized notion that's very whitewashed and apolitical.
So another question from our audience. This is mostly directed toward Dr. Reese, I believe. I love your emphasis on Black agency, care, and delight, even while combating anti-Blackness and inequalities pervasive in our food systems. Do you have advice for how to teach this complex nuance to undergraduates? In other words, how do we teach about extreme injustices but not strip people of their agency in doing so?
That's a good question. I teach a class called Food in the Racialized City, and it's organized around both kind of a history of food, Black food, and then there's like the section on food justice, food sovereignty, and it includes things like care. I think first of all, I was thinking about who's on your syllabus, and I'm happy to share some names of folks who's on my syllabus. Alison Alcon's works on my syllabus, Josh Spica, Monica White. I also include poetry from Ntozake Shange. There's a collection of essays, poetry, and recipes called If God Nobody Can, I think is the title. I may have botched that. I include Sadia Hartman. I include, basically I'm trying to get at that I include people who are both talking about food and not talking about food. And I think the poetry piece is so important to me, as is fiction more broadly, because I really do believe there's something liberating about not just focusing on social science research that is all about having an answer to a thing. And I think the biggest I could convey is that I try to get my students to not be so obsessed with having the right answer, and to think about like food with larger complex of relations. Yesterday, we had this really lovely class. We read this essay by Muriel Freeman, and it's called What My Grandfather's Garden Taught Me About Surviving as Black and Queer. And that wasn't specifically about food justice, right? The class is kind of in a food justice frame, and he was able to join us for the class, and we just got to talking about like what our relations to as humans to the more than human world. What does that look like? What can we learn from plants? Like we talked about all kinds of things. So my point here is that some of what has to happen is you've got to show undergrads that something else is possible. But then to show them that something else is possible, you got to be able to point them to sources that are working through the possibility that something else is possible. So that would be my answer to that, that like if a course is just built on if the whole course is readings on dispossession, then I'm going to walk away with an idea that that is what I should walk away from. But if the course is kind of like using dispossession as a context and a jumping point to think about, you know, a whole bunch of other questions, then I think that might open up some possibilities for students.
And that's so radical and so aligned with what I was mentioning before, just this marveling at your embodied praxis and how that's translating to pedagogy. And as you mentioned in your own work, you have this focus on the affective dimensions, right, of people's experiences with food access or lack thereof. But clearly that is an important tool to take to the classroom as well, is to create space for those affective possibilities to emerge.
Any other thoughts on the teaching question? Okay. We've touched a bit on issues of gentrification and urban planning and displacement. So this question has to do with those topics. And the participant wrote, community gardens and farms are stationary, but in the cities where I have worked, Brooklyn and Austin, gentrification and displacement are happening at a rapid rate. I'm trying to think through the ways to ensure access to community gardens when the people who have built the gardens might be displaced away from the spaces they created. Does Dr. Reese have any thoughts on mobile growing technologies or seed libraries or any other way to help people continue gardening wherever they are?
I have thoughts on people not being displaced. You know, I think that, you know, that for me is the thing, right? Like, I think seed saving is important. I think seed swapping is important, all of those things. And I don't have any like thoughtful, you know, profound thoughts about it. But I think the context of, I am thinking about the new volume, A Recipe for Gentrification, that kind of really gets into some of these questions around what gentrification means, and what particularly like what food means in the context of gentrification. And I'm thinking about, I don't know. I don't have an answer to mobile things, because I imagine when people get displaced, I don't know. Like, I'm trying to think through, like, if I were being displaced, what do I want? And I'm not sure, right? Like, I would want to not be displaced. So I keep getting stuck at that piece of like, what is the work of making sure that people can live in an age and place where they want to be. So I'm sorry I don't have any more concrete questions. Or responses to that.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question, because I also think it's kind of embedded in there is some nostalgia, as well as what we talked about earlier. Gentrification is such a layered issue, and I don't know that it is possible. I can't imagine a scenario in which displaced persons would transplant. I agree. That's a really difficult question, and I don't know that in what priority that would be on the list of a displaced person is transplanting of a garden or seeds, or I think that there would be other things that once there is a resettlement, I guess you could say, that would be a focus. But that's a very compelling question, provocative question.
Do folks have any just more general reflections on processes of gentrification and how that inflects these conversations?
Yeah, I do have to say, so I'm in the Dunbar Spring neighborhood, which was, historically African-American neighborhood in Tucson, and now not so much that. And Dunbar is is like this cultural center in the midst of a gentrifying neighborhood. And the hardest thing to do is what has been the hardest thing to do is bring African Americans back into the space to reclaim the garden space. And it has created contention, I guess you can say, among the Black folks that are like, you know, we don't really feel safe in the space. We don't really feel welcome in the space, even though it's Black space because of where it is located in this larger, you know, community. And so I think trying to reconcile those relationships with the community that is there, that you know, the mainly white community that is there now, with folks that are coming to reclaim space that was there to begin with, is such, it has been difficult. It has been really difficult. That's all I can say about it. And it's been 2 years, and Dr. Carney has, you know, borne witness to what that looks like and the rhetoric around it. And you know, we have a community garden committee that really struggles with that issue, and I don't have any answers.
Yeah, I am thinking about gentrification as a process. Like often it's kind of reduced to individual decision making. These people bought these houses here for this reason, and I think that's important. But like gentrification is a set of processes, and there's a lot of like flow of capital through these processes. And now that I live in Austin and I'm learning Austin and I walk around Austin several times a week, and I live on the east side of Austin, I think about this a lot. And this is not leading me anywhere about food, but I just want to paint this imagery. I walk around East Austin often, and I see Black Lives Matter signs and Latinx Lives Matter and all of the right social justice signs on gates, like gated houses in East Austin that was historically where Black folks have lived in this city. And I have to say that maybe part of my difficulty with working through this question is twofold. One, I can't afford to buy a house in this part of town. And I think that's important to say because I'm like a stable income, you know, should be able to buy a house anywhere I live person, right? So like that says something about the expensiveness of the city. And then the second thing, as I'm walking and I'm thinking about, you know, I'm walking past this $1 million, $700,000 $1 million homes, I'm thinking about gentrification as a process of not just displacement, but erasure, right? Like literally like erasing histories and communities that might be there. And I'm thinking about, like, I saw the comment in the chat about like if people are displaced around just wanting to think through how to like essentially spread resources to people who have been. Does the garden have to stay? Do people have to give up the garden, or should the garden stay if people are gone? And I think I just keep going back to the question of, I'm curious to Jennifer, who asked the question, if you have thoughts, and you know, you can not have to share these with me, but I would be curious on some reflection on have people been as eager to keep up with folks who started these gardens, knowing where they are, staying in relationship with them, as they've been to try to like give them resources. And that is less of a critique and really an invitation to think about, because I think that sometimes that savior complex looks a lot of different ways, right? And I wonder, has anyone asked people, what do they actually need or want?
Well, this is Jennifer. I think it will be easier for me to talk about it. So I'm trying to think about in areas like in Austin, I think right now people like, the thought is like, okay, East Austin is the traditional Black and brown community within Austin. But the reality is that there used to be Black communities all over Austin. And as people get displaced from the land, if you're if my task is to help people start community gardens and I see the rapid pace of gentrification, I'm trying to think through ways that I can not just invest a resource in a community that's then going to be gentrified. And I think that within Austin, the other layer of this is that there, the resources that are available to people are really limited, more so than in other cities I've lived in. So on top of the issue of displacement and the fact that the Black community is now shifting to North Austin, to South Austin, to other cities, I'm like, how can I in my role help people maintain a connection to the land? And I almost see the community gardens as like anchor institutions, the same way that churches are. So people might live in Manor, but they're coming back to maintain this relationship with a garden. And then on top of that, there's also people experiencing homelessness, people who might be homeless in a community where formerly they were housed. And what's the relationship between those communities and these places? So it is very complex. I'm not trying to disconnect people from the land, but there, you know, it's like, how do you allocate limited resources to help when my budget doesn't extend to buying a block and starting a community land trust, which is probably the solution that I would propose if I had those resources available to me.
Thank you for giving that context and that explanation. And I wonder, I think when you were talking, the thing that I kept thinking about, you know, like the refrain of staying connected to the land. And one thing I was thinking about, I'm super curious about, and of course you and I could talk at some other point since we both live in the same city, is if people are driving from out of town or the suburbs or whatever to come back to particular community gardens, I'm just curious about how many people do that, and what their motivations are for doing that. So that's my first thought. And then my second thought was, there's the kind of rooted in placeness that I think can be important, and people's connection to specific plots of land. And then there's the greater concern around, like, land is everywhere. So how do we cultivate something? What does it look like to cultivate that where people are, if that is the concern? I think I get you a little bit better now, after hearing what you were saying. And I don't know, I think there's probably lots of ways to do that. And I know it's hard to start from scratch. So I get now what you're saying about the seeds and stuff. And I think someone said in the chat around raised beds. I would give it some more thought. Let me be a little bit more thoughtful about it. But I think the question I would ask for people is it they're trying to maintain a connection to a specific piece of land, or is it that they're just looking for ways to continue what they were doing in one place in another place?
If I could just give a shout out to the Dunbar Pavilion and the work that Debbie Chess is leading there, because it's all around these themes of placemaking and intentional emplacement as connected to broader concerns for health and wellness and building community. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Reese, and all of our panelists and everyone who joined us for this conversation. It is now past 5, so I have to pull the plug, unfortunately. But I'm sure we can find ways to continue this conversation. You can follow Dr. Reese on Twitter. And also I wanted to say that this recording will be made available. We just have to get it closed captioned, and then it will be on the Center for Regional Food Studies website here at the U of A. And we plan to send out a note through the Eventbrite registration when that's available. And just a final thought, I wanted to let everyone who's still here know that the School of Geography, Development, and Environment is having another colloquium next week, and it's one of our special lectures honoring Jan Monk. She's a feminist geographer who's been here at the U of A. And that talk is about gender-based violence and collective trauma by Rachel Payne. So we invite you to join us. I just dropped all the information in the chat, and I hope you all will join us for more conversations in our colloquium series. So thank you again, everyone who sponsored this event, and to all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Eden. Thank
Dr.
you.
Felice.
And I'm gonna do one shameless, this is an amazing book.
Yes.
So is this. It is
Yeah.
so, it's fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Reese.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Good night. Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.
Thank you, Eden.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
I have one quick question.
Yes.